Please put your hands together for Ashley.
My great-grandparents were survivors of the Armenian genocide of 1915, and they ended up as refugees in Canada in 1920. Both of them had lost practically their entire families. And from those two people, they managed to rebuild their lives and their families, and that's where my grandfather grew up and my father grew up. But then my father went and joined the military, so I didn't actually live with any of my Armenian family. I only knew them very distantly. But as an adult, I started to think about how my Armenian identity and their culture might have impacted me as a person. And so I decided I had to go to Armenia. And I ended up going there to travel alone for 2 months by myself. And if you don't know, Armenia is a very rugged country in the Caucasus Mountains, just north of Iran, which is a very friendly part of the world. And so I was traveling by myself, and the one thing I was most worried about actually was the flight, because I'd been having a lot of problems with my ears. And someone recommended a neti pot. And if you don't know what a neti pot is, it's basically a teapot designed to pour hot water up your own nostrils, and so it comes out the other side to clear your sinuses. It's about the least sexiest invention humanity's ever come up with. So I bought one of these, though, and it was fantastic. I had no problems on the flight, and I was so excited. And I'm traveling around Armenia, and I'm learning about my great-grandparents' culture, and I'm learning about Armenia today, and it was just incredible. And I was staying with random people here and there, and I stayed with this one girl a few weeks into my trip, and she saw the neti pot in my bag, and she said, "Oh, those are fantastic. You just, you got to be so careful about boiling the water, because did you hear about those people in the US that died?" I had not heard about those people in the US that died. And I had not boiled the water at 4 a.m. before I got on the flight that morning when I left Sydney. But that was fine. I was feeling great. Didn't think about it again until a week later, when I woke up in the middle of the night and I had this intense pressure in my forehead. Now, what these people had died of, this woman told me, is there's this bacteria that apparently lives in tap water that you can ingest and it's no problem. But if it gets into your sinuses, it's like worms that actually eat your brain. And you die. This is a scientific fact. So I woke up with this pressure in my forehead, and my first thought was, brainworms. And then I thought, no, there's no chance, it's not possible. So I am a rational, reasonable person. That day, the pressure was still there, and it was weird. It wasn't a pain. It wasn't like anything I'd felt before, but I thought, it's the middle of summer. It's blazing hot. I'm probably just dehydrated. I drank like 5 liters of water. Pressure's still there. Day 2. It's probably a headache. It's probably some weird headache. Took a whole bunch of painkillers. Pressure's still there. Day 3. I'm probably just allergic to some weird plant in this country. So I took some antihistamines because I was carrying a pharmacy in my backpack. Pressure was still there. So by the third night, I did that thing you should never do when you're alone in a country with a corrupt, defunct medical system, which is to Google your symptoms. Here's a fact. If you type neti pot into Google, the first suggestion it brings up is neti pot deaths. So I started reading these symptoms, and I became convinced that I had these brain worms. And only 2 people have ever survived them. So then I became convinced I had 12 days to live. And I was looking at reliable websites. This was like the CDC and the World Health Organization. I knew how to research. So I called my husband. And it's 9 p.m. in Armenia, which means it's 3 a.m. in Sydney, which is not a time most people appreciate getting a phone call. And it was also happened to be Sydney time, our wedding anniversary. And I told him about my symptoms and the websites, and I sent him the links, and he looked through everything. But the thing is, my husband is 4th-generation Canadian, and yet so English. and that even his wife's imminent death could not move him in any way. And he said simply, "It's probably fine, just go back to sleep." So I, of course, could not sleep, despite taking sleeping pills that I also had in my bag. And so I spent the night drafting letters that I planned to send to my family to explain my bizarre upcoming death. And the thing about being woefully, devastatingly convinced that you're going to die is that you really have a chance to think about the people that matter to you and how they matter to you and why they're important. So I had asked my husband to call me the next day to check in on how I was doing, because I figured at that point, if my symptoms were getting worse, I was going to need to make the call as to whether I pulled the plug on the rest of my trip and I flew to who knows where to get medical treatment to try and see if I could become the third person who had survived brainworms. Or if I just decided I would stay in Armenia and I would let people come to me, like my husband and my parents if they wanted to, and I would just die there, because there was actually kind of a romantic feeling of that, you know. My great-grandparents had left Armenia to survive, and I had come back to Armenia to die. Now, remember, it's our wedding anniversary. My husband did not call me. We are still married, amazingly. And I think that was really the takeaway for me, is that I was so overjoyed when 2 or 3 days later I realized the symptoms had gone on long enough that it couldn't be the brainworms. They weren't eating my brain and taking away my sense of smell. I was obsessively smelling things to make sure. And I was so happy that I suddenly had this second chance at life, that I managed to somehow forgive him, even though that was totally a dick move. And I'm here today.